Welcome back to Fuel Up Classic. Now, before I tell you why the Jaguar XJ X308 model in particular is a modern classic bargain, let's take things back to 1997 when this model was launched, and picture the scene, because this is how I imagine somebody who bought this car new might have gone about things. You're happily smoking around in your old Jaguar XJ that you've had for a number of years. You're happy with it, but really it's getting a little bit long in the tooth now, and the friends at the golf club have all upgraded to the latest Mercedes or BMW, but you're a Jag man at heart. So naturally, what do? You take yourself off to the nearest Jaguar dealership and you take a look at the all-new Jaguar XJ. Walk into the showroom and here it is, in pride of place. But on first glance, you think, well, hold on, there's quite a few years between my two Jaguars and this just looks the same, doesn't it? But not really. Look a little bit closer and you can see that everything is enhanced. There is clearly a lineage in the styling here, which, let's be honest, the XJ series cars are some of the prettiest saloons ever made. But this car is very different. Externally, they've made a few changes for sure, and internally as well. But it's what's going on under the bonnet where this car gets radically different from its predecessors. Naturally, we've got to take a closer look at that and take it out for a drive. So let's do exactly that. Let's take a closer look under the bonnet, because that's where things start to become clear that this was a new Jaguar for a whole new era. And if you lift up this big heavy bonnet here, you start to see where things differ from XJs of old. Gone was the old 6 and 12 cylinder options that had powered the XJ for decades in various different updated formats. But for the very first time, a V8 was shoehorned under the engine bay of a Jaguar XJ. Now, Jag claimed at the time that this engine is as refined as their legendary V12. So we're going to take it out for a drive and find out exactly if that's true or not. But what I can tell you is this particular car is powered by the 3.2 litre variant. It's the baby of the range, but you're not going to feel shortchanged by that. There's 240 brake horsepower on tap. 0 to 60 is good in about 8 seconds, and top speed 140 miles an hour. And a 5-speed automatic gearbox as well on this one, another upgrade over the old XJs. So overall, it's a very impressive package. And if I was to tell you that average fuel consumption is around 23 miles per gallon, well, perhaps you might not be as shocked by that as you may have first thought. It's certainly a massive improvement over XJs of old, where average fuel consumption is easily in the mid-teens. You can get 30 miles per gallon out of one of these on a slow and steady run. So perhaps it won't be as ruinously expensive to run as you might suspect. But Jaguar made a lot of bold claims about this engine, with it being super refined, perfect fit for the car. Let's take it out for a drive and see, after all these years, if that's true, and if in 2024, spending your own hard-earned money on a Jaguar XJ is well worth it. Firstly, and I think it's worth mentioning, after 25 years, I can confirm that the aircon on this car is absolutely ice cold. Oh, there's an E-Type Jaguar just gone past. But as you would expect, in here it's Jaguar business as usual. And by that, I mean there's lashings of wood and leather. Everything feels nice to the touch. It's just a really cozy place to be. It's characterful as well. I think just the wood and also the smell of it as well. They've got their own unique smell to them. It's quite strange, but it's an intoxicating blend. And I am, of course, sat on the comfiest seats known to man. Of course, they're electric on this one. But it's a bit like, and this is going to sound cliche, but stepping into an XJ cabin of any era is a bit like putting a comfy pair of slippers on. It just sort of molds around you. But you might be surprised for such a big car that there isn't a huge amount of interior space in here. It's something that's always been the case with the XJ. They managed to produce a huge car, but the cockpit is actually really quite small, snug if I'm being polite. But nonetheless, it's not too bad. The only time that you might notice it, and it might be a bit of an issue, is that if you're regularly taking sort of 6 foot plus adults in the back of the car, legroom can be a little bit limited, and headroom as well. But to combat that lack of space, you can get this car in a long wheelbase option, and from memory it gives you about 5 extra inches of legroom in the back and makes a big difference. You can tell that by the rear door just being visibly longer than a standard wheelbase model. But nonetheless, an XJ X308 interior is a lovely place to be. It really is, and it's a massive improvement over the predecessor, the X300, which in itself kind of inherited a dashboard from the XJ40. This particular model was the first one to kind of move the game on a little bit, and what I like about it as well is not only have you got all the wood and the leather and the lovely clear dials, but there's no touch screens in here. There's physical buttons, and for me it's just all the better for it. Probably wondering, well, what does it really feel like to pilot an old XJ down the road? And it's exactly as you're probably imagining at home. It's supremely comfortable. It requires very little input from the driver, to be perfectly honest. You're sort of cocooned from the outside world, and even an old 88,000 mile example like this can put a lot of modern cars to shame. The steering is super light. It requires very little input, and in return you don't get a lot of feedback, but that's not really what this type of car is about at all, so it shouldn't matter. What it does is just take you from A to B in supreme luxury, supreme quietness as well. It's so quiet in here. There's no creaks, there's no rattles, and even the worst of UK potholes don't upset it at all. It just takes it all in its stride. And a properly looked after XJ of this era rides just as well, if not a little bit better, than a Bentley or Rolls-Royce of the era. And I genuinely think that's true. It really does. And that V8 up front, well, Jaguar claimed it was as refined as their legendary V12, and I think there might be some truth in that as well. It's very quiet. You can't really hear it at all on idle, and it's only really when you're pushing on that it starts to make itself known. But nonetheless, it doesn't give you a nice sort of V8 burble or growl at any point. It's just smooth, hushed, plenty of power, 240 brake horsepower in this one. 4-litre variants gained about 290 brake horsepower, a little bit more torque as well, and strangely no worse fuel economy. And then of course there was the supercharged version, and I don't want to talk about that one too much because I am going to feature an XJR on the channel soon. It's a different animal, that car. But even though this is just the 3.2 litre, it's perfectly adequate. I've not once felt like it's wanting for power. And an XJ of this era is kind of everything you imagine. It's just a very easy and lovely place to be. Now, when it comes to that gearbox, well, it's a massive improvement over its predecessor, the X300, which only ever had a 4-speed auto gearbox or a manual option. There was never a manual option on the X308. Just a 5-speed ZF box, gets on with the job really well, and somewhat comically it's got a sport mode as well, which actually does seem to pep things up a little bit, but I don't really think it suits the character of the car. But nonetheless, it's worth mentioning. It's there. It does sort of sport things up for a little bit of a brisker pace, but I prefer to just drive it in normal mode. It's perfectly adequate for the type of car. And 25 years on and 88,000 miles in this particular car, it's hard to think of another car that offers a better and more relaxed way to travel. And I can't believe that this is less than a 10-year-old Ford Fiesta. I know what I'd rather be driving, and I know the associated running costs will be higher, but what a car for the money. Now, the words cheap old Jaguar can leave a lot of people running for the hills, and I do understand that. These cars have a somewhat unfair reputation at times, and that's actually often no fault of Jaguar itself. It's actually kind of analysing how these cars depreciate over time and what happens with them. You see, XJs have a bit of a funny reputation, especially ones from this era, because when they were new, let's be honest, they were likely bought by an older clientele that had a little bit of money in the bank and maintained it exactly as it should be. You'd likely see a new XJ outside the golf club, or just as likely outside your local Freemasons lodge. But fast forward a few years, a few thousand miles, perhaps a few more owners, and you're more likely to see an old XJ outside some of the less than particularly nice drinking establishments near you. Unfortunately, they do fall from grace quite quickly, and that lies the problem with the XJ. You can pick one of these up from as little as £1,500, but that's likely to be, unless you're incredibly lucky, a huge money pit in the long run. You're far better off stepping into a really good, properly maintained example like this for less than £5,000. In the long term, that's going to be less stressful, and I can guarantee you less expensive as well. But nonetheless, this is now an old car. It's 25 years old, this particular one, and some of them are even older than that now. You do need to look out for a few big ticket items on an X308 XJ before you part with your cash. I'm not saying every single car is going to need these jobs doing, but it's good to know and good to go into any kind of ownership with your eyes wide open. And let's start with that V8 engine. It's a great engine overall, but there are some things to look out for. The cooling system needs to be in absolute tip-top condition. So check for that in the evidence of the history that it's had probably a water pump, radiator hoses replaced, that kind of thing, regular antifreeze and coolant changes. It will reward you for that. These cars do not like to get hot at all. That also brings me on to a problem that they had in period, and again, not uniquely a Jaguar problem, but the old Nickersill liner issue that affected a lot of cars back in the late 90s. Well, Jaguar were far better than others at warranting these engines, and it's not uncommon to find an X308 with a replacement engine at very few miles and probably only a few years old. It did happen quite a lot. But fast forward to now, the Nickersill problem is a thing of the past. I wouldn't worry about it personally at all. But there's one big thing to look out for on an X308 XJ. It's a steel-bodied construction. It's the last steel-bodied XJ. And unfortunately, some old legacies were passed on with this model, and that is rust. These cars can rust at an incredible rate, and they will be very expensive to put right properly. And by that I mean the floors themselves, the wheel arches, the wings, the sills, everything can corrode. So you want to be checking those as much as you can. If you can get the car up in the air, even better, because that will be the difference between a really good example and a really bad one that's going to cost you a fortune. The gearbox wise, well, that's just the standard 5-speed ZF gearbox. It was fitted in a load of cars from this era. On the whole, very reliable. It does like regular oil changes around the 60,000 mile mark. So check for evidence that that's been done. But other than that, it's a really nice silky smooth transmission. Shouldn't give you too many issues. Interior wise, well, they fare very well. Lighter leather will show wear more than darker leather. That's the nature of the beast, really. Bolsters on the seats wear where people get in and out, and the headlining usually sags. I know for a fact that both this car and my Series 3 XJ6 have both had headlining replacements in the past. Costs about £500, but makes a huge difference to the overall feel of the interior once you have it done. Oh, I should mention the electrics as well, because that's another legacy that seems to be carried on from some dark days of Jaguar or British cars in general. And on the whole, the X308 is very solid. As long as the car's used regularly, electrics are pretty good. So I wouldn't be too concerned on that front, and far better than my old XJ6 Series 3, that's for sure. Overall, I've listed the worst case scenario, but I'd rather do that to make sure that someone doesn't get their fingers burnt when they part with their hard-earned cash. But less than £5 gets you behind the wheel of what I think is a modern classic bargain. There's an awful lot of car for your money. And I wonder if in a few years we'll start to see values of these really start to climb. But for now, it's an attractive and certainly very luxurious package that I think you could have great fun with. You could use it every day if you wanted, or just enjoy it at the weekends, take the family out. I mean, it's an old Jag. Nothing quite drives like an old Jag. So there we have it. Another video, plenty more on the way. I'm also going to get a supercharged version of the XJ on the channel very soon. So please do subscribe if you haven't already.